9 years ago, I found myself in a doctor's office contemplating the nature versus nurture debate from a fresh perspective. You see, I had been trained as a geneticist. Identical twins have had a profound impact on scientists' understanding of nature and nurture. Studies on identical twins who were separated at birth and raised in separate households have helped us understand different traits that are more affected by nature versus nurture or the home environment. For example, some traits like IQ or criminal tendencies are more affected by your nature in the house that you grew up in. On the other hand, other traits like depression in men or your preference for a particular political party are more influenced by your environment than by your genes. So what about identical twins who are raised in the same home environment? Their nature and their nurture are almost the same. And yet, any parent of identical twins, myself included, can quickly point out differences in their children. One twin may have more of a preference for certain types of foods, or may have more aptitude for a certain sport or a musical instrument. And sometimes, health differences can arise in these children. For example, there are reports of autism or asthma or bipolar disorder arising in one twin at a young age while the other one remains unaffected. How do we explain these differences given that the genes is the same in these children, and for the large part, their home environment has been the same too? Well, it turns out that some of these differences can be explained by a third very powerful influence on our lives besides nature and nurture, and this is epigenetics. I'm going to talk to you today about what epigenetics is and how it impacts your life, even if you're not an identical twin. So epi, meaning on top of, and genetics, your genes, literally refers to a set of instructions that sits down on top of our genes. So you might be wondering, when does all this epigenetic information get laid down on our genes? And the answer is that much of it happens during our embryonic development. So interestingly, when you were first conceived and you were just comprised of a few undifferentiated embryonic stem cells, which had the potential to become any cell in your body, your chromatin didn't have many epigenetic marks on it. It was only as your cells began to divide and receive signals and information from surrounding cells that the epigenetic marks began to accumulate, and then the genes began to get turned off and turned on, and the muscle cell became very different from the neuron. This brings me to a really important point about epigenetics, and that is that epigenetic marks can be influenced by the environment. And when I say environment, I don't just mean those surrounding cells that tell a neuron to become a neuron. I also mean the environment outside of the developing embryo. So the food that mom eats, or the prenatal vitamins that she takes, or the cigarettes that she smokes, or the stresses that she encounters at home or at work, can all be transmitted as chemical signals through her bloodstream to her developing fetus, where they can get laid down as epigenetic marks that affect the fetus's own genes and long-term health. Now, this has been shown experimentally in mice. Mice contain a gene called agouti, which makes them obese and yellow. And this gene and these traits can be passed down from generation to generation so that an agouti mother will give rise to a fat, yellow offspring if that offspring contains the agouti gene. Now here's something interesting about the agouti gene. It can be turned off if silencing epigenetic marks accumulate around it. So, if a pregnant agouti mother is fed a diet which is supplemented with these silencing epigenetic marks, those marks will be chemically transmitted to the DNA of her embryo, where they'll accumulate around that agouti gene and effectively turn it off. Her embryo will maintain those marks, and so it will be born and grow up to be an adult mouse that's thin and brown and healthy. Even though this mother is genetically identical at both sets of these offspring, you can see that the diet that she consumed during her pregnancy can affect the health and appearance of her offspring. Now, this has, of course, implications beyond the mouse world, because studies in humans have shown that women who don't eat well during their pregnancy, who eat bad foods, will go on to have children who are more susceptible to developing obesity and cardiovascular disease. Likewise, if women smoke during their pregnancy, their children will grow up to have a greater chance of developing asthma. These correlations between maternal behavior during pregnancy and the long-term health consequences for their offspring are thought to be linked by epigenetics, much as you've seen here in the case of mice. Now, another important point to make about epigenetics is that these types of marks can be transmitted not only from a pregnant female to her fetus, but also from generation to generation, if the marks are put down on our sperm or eggs. So if you're in the audience and you're not pregnant, and you're not even thinking about conceiving, think about this, because the lifestyle decisions that you make today can still affect future generations. For example, a long-term study was conducted in Sweden and England that showed that young boys who overate or started smoking during their prepubescent years, as their sperm were starting to develop, went on to have sons and grandsons with significantly shorter lifespans. It's believed that the epigenetic marks that were transmitted by their diet and smoking decisions affected the long-term health of their future generations. This type of epigenetic information, of course, can also be passed through females to their daughters and granddaughters if the epigenetic marks are laid down on their eggs. Now, this idea of transgenerational inheritance of epigenetic marks is still being debated and studied in terms of humans, but I should add that non-human organisms, mice, flies, worms, there's mounting evidence that this theory holds true. In fact, it's being shown in the lab that over tens of generations, epigenetic marks can be passed down. Now, another thing to know about epigenetics is that they don't just affect us when we're a developing embryo or when the sperm and egg that conceived us were developing. They can also affect us after our birth. And this is particularly relevant as we think about our brains, which continue to grow and develop throughout our lives. Take this example from rats. Rats contain a gene called the glucocorticoid receptor, and this gene can be expressed or read in a certain region of the rat's brain, and when it is, it helps the rat cope with stressful situations. So the more receptor that a rat has in this region of the brain, the better it will handle stress. Now, there are studies that have shown that interactions between a rat mother and her pups during the first week of their life can have long-term consequences for how much glucocorticoid receptor those pups will grow up to have in their brains, and therefore how well they'll handle stress. This is how this works. When rat pups are born, their glucocorticoid receptor gene is surrounded by a number of these silencing epigenetic marks. This effectively turns the gene off. And yet, if a rat mother extensively licks and grooms her pups, basically takes good care of them during the first week of their life, those epigenetic silencing marks can be removed from the gene. This allows the glucocorticoid receptor gene to turn back on, and it stays on in those pups' brains throughout their lives. So they grow up to be well-adjusted animals who deal well with stress. If a rat mother ignores her pups, that glucocorticoid receptor gene will maintain those silencing epigenetic marks. They won't go away, and they'll stay in those pups' brains throughout their lives. These rats will grow up to be very anxious in stressful situations.